How can we build community around solutions to our climate crisis? Welcome to the Convocations program at Carleton College. I'm your host, Carrie Rott, Director of Events. We will be together for 1 hour and will include time for questions. Now you may click on that Q&A tab on your screen to submit your questions at any time, and then I'll pose them to our guest speaker at the conclusion of our time together. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is co-creator and co-host of the Spotify Gimlet podcast on climate solutions titled How to Save a Planet. She also co-edited the climate anthology All We Can Save, a collection of essays from women climate activists. Many of today's most compelling climate leaders across generations are women, especially Black, Indigenous, and other women of color. Despite burdens, systemic barriers, and burnout, women are already leading boldly and effectively and throwing open doors to welcome people into climate work. A powerful, transformational, climate feminist ecosystem is emerging. Dr. Johnson is a former adjunct professor at New York University in the Department of Environmental Studies and previously worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She was the national co-director of partnerships for the inaugural March for Science in 2017. She publishes widely, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Scientific American. She's on the 2021 Time Next list and was named one of ELL's 27 women leading on climate. Welcome to Carleton College, Dr. Johnson. It's great to have you here today. Well, let me begin by just saying that you are highly admired by our students. Now, something that they often experience is having multiple aspirations and trying to find a way to address them all.
Yeah.
Could you share with us your path to the work that you are doing?
I guess my path was like avoiding being forced to choose, right? Like so often we feel like we can only do one thing. And my path has been to say, like, I'm interested in all these different things. How can I maybe figure out how to work at the intersection of them? And becoming okay with not being, you know, a renowned expert in everything, but sort of being a person that connects the dots. And I think for people who really care about academic rigor, that's a bit challenging. So, and it may sound ironic for someone with a PhD to be saying this, but my dissertation research really had one chapter in each of the different key disciplines that relate to conservation. So there was something on ecology, something on fisheries management, then something on behavioral economics, something on sociology and anthropology, and something on policy. Because to me, I was like, I need to understand all these things if I'm going to help figure out how do we sustainably manage coral reefs. And that was a lot of my work in the Caribbean. But in the longer arc of how I sort of got here professionally, I think it's pretty common for kids to fall in love with the ocean, right? Certainly nothing unique about wanting to be a marine biologist when you're 5. It's a pretty common dream job. And there's part of the story is that I'm just stubborn and stuck with it. But another part of the story is I realized that ocean conservation would actually let me do all these other things too. And that's what made me realize I could stick with it forever. Like my commitment to social justice is like woven into my work. My interest in policy, my interest in like understanding the role of corporations and the private sector, like all of it is woven in. And to me, that's what makes it a lifetime of work that I'm excited about. Because I just like didn't have the aptitude for studying, say, like octopus reproductive biology. Like I want to watch the documentary about it. I don't want to be stuck in the lab for 5 years figuring it out. And so I'm glad that there are people who are doing that work so I can learn about it and read about it. And I'm so glad for my rigorous scientific training so that I can understand other people's research and figure out how that can be used to inform policymaking and how that can be used in science communication. But I think it's just a matter of like sorting out like, what am I good at and where's my role in all of this? And I've found that sort of helping to weave all these threads together is something that I enjoy, and we need more people doing.
What has been your experience as a Black woman who has emerged a leader in the environmental movement?
This is a weird question for me because being Black has never been a primary identity for me, which is a very weird thing to say in the United States of America. I'm biracial. My mom is white, of Irish and Canadian descent, and my dad is Black from Jamaica. And there's something particular about the Black immigrant experience that's quite different from the Black American experience being a descendant of enslaved people. My dad grew up in a place where he had great education. He had lots of opportunities. He was not in a minority. And so his experience sort of transmitted down to me was just a very different part of that identity. And I was much closer to the white side of my family growing up. All those cousins were nearby. And going to private schools on scholarship my whole life, I just had like a very different racial context than perhaps people assume when they say like, you're a Black woman doing science. I was always very comfortable being the only one in a way that some people are not that comfortable. And I also had just like quite low expectations for being understood, for being accepted. I was just like, I'm going to do my thing. And I'm going to work really hard and we'll see how it goes. So that's sort of a long preamble to the answer. But it kind of explains my discomfort with speaking on behalf of a larger group of people, right? And so when I talk often about race and climate, it is relying on data, right? Relying on polling data, relying on my personal experiences working in the Caribbean and growing up in Brooklyn, as opposed to ever attempting to speak for Black Americans on climate. But we know, for example, that according with the results of polling by Yale and George Mason universities are that when you ask Americans how concerned they are about climate, it is 49% of white Americans who are concerned, 57% of Black Americans, and 69% of Latinx Americans. And so it's very important to me that we specifically dispel the myth that white people care more about the environment, because if we allow that falsehood to remain, then we miss a lot of opportunities to collaborate, to welcome more people into this work, because we assume that people of color don't care as much, which just is quantitatively false. And I think it's always important to remind ourselves of that, like this vision of, you know, a white man in a Patagonia fleece driving an electric car, sort of like looking off in the distance of a forest. Like, we've been sold this myth that that is the iconic environmentalist, and it's just not true. And so I think of like, when I think of race and climate and environmental issues, there's two sort of sides of it, right? There's who is most impacted by climate, by extreme weather events. We know that is communities of color, poor communities across the world, including in the US. So we know who's bearing a disproportionate burden of the impacts of hurricanes, floods, wildfires, droughts, all of that stuff. But we also know that those communities care a lot and could be a much bigger part of solutions if they were welcomed in, if they had the resources they needed, if they were unburdened by racism, sexism, you know, the history in this country that has just made fewer options for some people than others. And that there's this really important solution side too. We want to talk all about like who is the victim, but I want to talk about also like who are the leaders we need, who are the heroes that can help this, because the climate crisis requires that we change everything, right? We have to change, as Carleton College is doing, our sources of electricity. We have to transform our entire electricity system. We have to transform transportation and buildings and manufacturing and agriculture and land use and all of it. So we need creative leaders in every sector. We need leaders in every community to drive all of these changes forward. And so to me, it's just like, do we want to succeed? Fundamentally, if we want to succeed at addressing the climate crisis, we need to make sure that everyone who has good ideas, everyone who can gather people and help them to charge ahead with solutions is welcome to be a part of this work.
Why is it important to recognize and affirm climate leaders who are women?
Honestly, for the same reason, right? Like, to think that we could somehow solve the climate crisis, but not include half the brain power of humanity is sort of absurd, right? Like, to think that we could solve the climate crisis without people of color is also absurd. So I think, to me, it's just an all hands on deck situation. But there's really interesting and very compelling social science data around the quantitative benefits of making sure that women have an equal seat at the table when it comes to making decisions around climate. When you have, for example, more women, more seats in parliament that are occupied by women, those governments pass stronger environmental protections, protect more natural areas, actually enforce those regulations. When you have women leading international climate negotiations, like through the United Nations, that's when you actually get an agreement for the first time, the Paris Agreement. When you have teenage girls who are leading the climate strike movement around the world, not just Greta Thunberg, who we hear about a lot, but the fact that teenage girls all over the world said, that's a good idea, I'm doing that in my town. That's why we have the youth climate movement, right? This stepping up to lead. And of course, anyone of any gender can do these things and can exhibit the leadership traits that we often associate more with women. It's not to say like anyone needs to stick to American social gender norms. I would not advocate for that, but to say the opportunity of a more balanced groups of people doing this work will just get us a lot further, because I mean, and obviously the leadership that we've had has not been adequate. So because we're in quite a mess. So definitely time to welcome in some more folks.
Well, you certainly make a compelling case for reframing sustainability and climate crisis, evolving it from simply a scientific carbon counting exercise to a movement that fosters love and care for all people, creatures, our planet. Why and how do you ground your sustainability work in social justice?
I think just otherwise it won't work. Like, if we don't care about people, we don't care about each other, then we'll end up with like a weird technological dystopia, right? Like a lot of the way that I think we've been talking and thinking about climate solutions has been like solar panels, electric cars, which are great. I own an electric car. There's solar panels on the roof of my mom's barn, right? Like, those things are useful, but that's not enough, right? Because we do need to transform our society and our relationships with nature, our expectations of ecosystems being there to serve us as is really problematic, as opposed to us being a part of ecosystems. And so I sort of like cringe at myself when I talk about these things. My scientific training sort of makes me shy away from the more emotional parts of this work. But I think my motivation for doing this is certainly love, right? I don't get up every day wanting to like yell facts at people. Like that's not going to convince anyone. And also like, that doesn't sound very fun, right? So to the extent that we can, you know, have our love of nature, have our love of culture and society be really driving, or our love of solutions. I think one of the directions that my work is going now is actually more collaboration with artists, because I feel like we've been too technical. And now, like, I just keep using this word welcoming, like, how do we make it clear that there is a role for everyone? And a lot of that is a cultural piece and a communications piece. So that has led me to start forging some new collaborations in other fields that I never thought I would be working with.
You've said in other places, racism derails our efforts to save the planet. Could you explain why we can't solve the environmental crisis until Black Lives Matter?
It's that same thing. I mean, there are tens of millions of Americans, Black Americans, who are concerned about the climate crisis, but it's sort of ridiculous to expect them to focus our energies on climate when there's these moment to moment pressing matters of safety, right? And so addressing racism will unburden tens of millions of Americans who want to be helpful, to be able to dedicate that attention that they instead are currently focusing on social justice issues to some of these other things. And it's not a matter of like either or which is more important. Like we clearly need to do it all at the same time. So I guess just having a more holistic and integrated approach to this, I think, is where we need to go, because clearly these things aren't separate, right? There are people experiencing the world as it exists. And so it's important to solve problems as they actually exist, not some oversimplified version of the problem. And a lot of environmentalists often are so concerned about climate, they're like, everything else has to wait. And my response is like, it can't wait, because then we won't have the right people around the table coming up with the solutions that work in every place in every sector. And yeah, that's how I feel about that.
So you're saying that the environmental movement is due for a reboot focused on raising up marginalized populations, engaging feminist frameworks, and highlighting the inextricable ties between climate justice and racial justice and social justice. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't use the word reboot, because it's like very much this like it's a technology sort of like mindset of we'll just restart the program and then the bugs will be worked out. And the term that I use, or the metaphor that I like to use, is one of a renaissance, this like feminist climate renaissance. What would a climate movement look like that actually cared about gender equality and justice? And the word renaissance to me is so much better than like revolution in this context, right? Because we use all this, war and technology language to describe the climate crisis, and we're not like fighting the atmosphere, right? We're not fighting climate change. We're not battling greenhouse gases. We're dealing with humans who've made really bad decisions and put us in this mess. A small group of people with a lot of money and power, right? Like it's not each of us who've equally contributed to this problem. So I think it's important to frame that as like, fossil fuel executives, the bankers who have financed all of that stuff, knowing full well since the 80s what the impacts of that would be, and taking on risks for the rest of humanity that they really had no right taking on. And so this Renaissance term, to me, it means rebirth, right? And it also is about the arts and thinking about how do we focus more on what we want to create as opposed to what we just want to avoid, right? I feel like we've been avoiding the climate apocalypse, the fire and brimstone, the day after tomorrow, the uninhabitable earth. Like, we're very clear we don't want that. And so we're sort of like, okay, we should do this other thing, but we often don't know what this other thing looks like. And I think more of this, a deeper understanding of what we're working for would actually help us get there a lot faster, because it makes it more concrete. And that creates the motivation that we need, I think.
Renaissance and rebirth, definitely better terms than reboot for this work. So how can we do this work better so that our solutions lift up communities that are historically marginalized rather than maintaining the status quo or further marginalizing them?
Yeah. The answer to me has always been very simple, which is we need to listen. We need to listen to communities who are most impacted by the various ravages of climate change, because of course they've thought about solutions and what they would do differently if they had more resources, right? I think so often there's this perception that like academics or corporate or nonprofit executives have the answers and they're going to like tell communities what needs to be done. And sort of like just it's very patriarchal, it's very sort of colonial, it's very sort of like, we know what's best for you, which is not a good look. Instead of saying like, you probably know what's best for you, why don't you share with us your insights into what the opportunities are for this renaissance in your community, and what do you need and what are your priorities and what are you really seeing as the opportunities when we talk about, for example, green jobs. What industries are people excited about getting training to be a part of? What kinds of shifts in curricula are needed in order to have people prepared to be emerging out of school and into these this changing world? And what kinds of collaborations are really powerful, right? Is there a sense in which community organizations can be partnering with environmental groups, can be partnering with companies and academic institutions? I think all of my work, as you noted in introducing me, is very collaborative. All of the things that I've created are co-founded, right? I co-founded Urban Ocean Lab, my policy think tank. I co-created, co-edited the anthology, All We Can Save. And we purposely brought in as many different voices and perspectives as we could for that. And then I co-founded the nonprofit around that and co-created the podcast that I host. And to me, it's always been about like, who are all the right people to be involved in this? And I think that mindset is useful at many different scales, especially because people are often thinking about what they can do as like very inward looking and individual. We get sort of obsessed with our own carbon footprint or our own waste. And I think it's important, obviously, to minimize our own individual impacts on the planet that are negative. But if we could very easily spend all of our time and energy on that and never make any like broader ripples in the world. And so thinking about who we can team up with, who we can collaborate with, what groups we can join, local chapters of environmental organizations, student groups, etc., I think is something that's not emphasized enough. Like, what are we joining? Who are we doing this with? Not just like, what are you doing, but like, what's the team? Like, who's your climate squad? And it's been really fun for me to have some really deep and nourishing partnerships with my colleagues who, I mean, you find people who are on the same page as you and you can like create cool projects to do together that are actually quite fun, as opposed to just like, we think of climate work as being miserable, but that part of the misery is optional. You can just like love what you do and be contributing to climate solutions.
It seems that what we need are action-oriented approaches to the environmental crises, turning talk and promises and commitments into actual big time change. What would be your recommendations for getting people to move beyond awareness and into taking action?
So I used to hate this question because I didn't have a good answer to it. And I think I have a better one now. So we'll see what folks think. But basically, for follow on what I just said, I think we can each find our role in this and move from concern to action by very deliberately mapping out what we want our role to be. And the exercise that I've done that I've encouraged other people to do is to think about a Venn diagram with 3 overlapping circles. And the first circle would be, what are you good at? What skills are you bringing to the table, whether that's your academic training, your creative skills, your network, money, what do you have, right? And then think about, like, of all of the climate solutions that are needed in electricity and agriculture, in bike lanes and composting, in electing politicians who get it, in shifting the cultural status quo, right? There's a gazillion things that need to be done. Which solution or 2 are you most passionate about contributing to? What do you want to solve? And then the third one is, what brings you joy? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What do you love doing? Because to me, this is a marathon, right? This is the work of our lifetime. So it has to be something that will keep you going, or else we'll all burn out and get depressed and it's a mess. So I think because there's so much work to do, it gives us this range of choice, and then figuring out, like, what is at the epicenter of that Venn diagram for each of us. So for example, as someone with a PhD in marine biology who's from Brooklyn, and I love coastal cities, and I'm just a huge nerd for policy and care deeply about justice, all of those things merge together for me in thinking about what is the future of coastal cities. 1/3 of Americans live in coastal cities. This is not some coastal elite issue. It's like 1 in 3 people here who are at risk because of impacts of climate change, from heat waves to sea level rise to storms, right? And we're just not prepared for what's coming. And so Urban Ocean Lab, this policy think tank I co-founded, is really working exactly at the nexus of one of my Venn diagrams, which is to combine the things that I know about, the things I care about, and some really delightful colleagues and creative approaches to that work that bring me joy. So bust out your colored pencils and see what your diagram looks like.
Let me bring this home to the Carleton College campus. Since the completion of the central heating plant here in 1910, steam boilers have kept Carleton College students warm through every cold Minnesota winter. And now Carleton is turning off its last campus steam boiler for good. And the summer campus will complete a full transition from steam to hot water and geothermal heating and cooling. So by recycling heat and storing it in 3 geothermal bore fields, Carleton's geothermal heat pump system will dramatically reduce fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions. So through wind energy and geothermal and other campus advancements, Carleton has cut its carbon footprint in half over the last decade. But acknowledging that sustainability work at Carleton is not done yet, what are your suggestions for engaging a broader campus community and strengthening the community that we already have?
Well, first, congratulations. This is a really exciting milestone, and I'm glad to be here when you're celebrating that and be a part of that. I think academic institutions have such an important role to play in leading by example. We've seen that time and time again with all sorts of different social movements, the ways that, especially with pressure from students, universities have stepped up in a variety of ways, whether that's around apartheid or other elements of social justice and sustainability. So kudos to Carleton. And I guess I would say I meant to look this up and it crossed my mind and then I forgot. But has Carleton divested its endowment from fossil fuels? That's a really big one.
Not completely yet, no.
Not
Yep.
yet. So
Yep.
I know
Yep.
this is something that a lot of universities are doing, and there are now there's more and more information on the financial benefits of doing that, that because fossil fuel companies are not doing well right now, you actually like earn a better return if they're not part of your portfolio. So I think the hesitance has often been around people being nervous about the financial impacts of that decision, but that's no longer a factor. So for the students who are listening who want to push for that, that is a very important use of your energy, and your voices certainly matter hugely in that regard. I think it's sort of hard to answer this question without knowing the university, the college in much more detail. But one of the things that I love that is happening right now is that people are starting to weave climate information and themes into all different courses, right? It's not just for your atmospheric chemistry class. Like this is for your ecology and economics and policy and law. Like climate crosses all these disciplines. And for example, when we think about even studying business, and as businesses are building their financial models, and what are they incorporating as far as risk and expectations of future extreme weather events on their operations, right? Like we need to start factoring this into the way that we approach problem solving more generally, because climate is the context for everything. And so to the extent that professors can make sure that they're covering climate, even if they think their topic is not really at the center of this, I think that will help students be better prepared for dealing with the world that they graduate into, right? That is complex and has all of these different things that are just a part of how decisions need to get made. And when we leave climate out of decisions, when we pretend that it's not a factor, that really gets us into trouble because we're not prepared for things. So that's, I think, a really fun opportunity is to think about how to weave climate information into classes on communication, like what is effective science communication? How do we think about this in terms of mathematical modeling and risk and statistics? How do we think about this in terms of business and economics and certainly politics, especially in this country where climate policy is so polarized. So I think that would be a cool direction to go more deeply in.
This has been quite thought-provoking, incredibly so, and I thank you for this. But let's turn to some audience questions now that have been submitted. And here's one: how can governments, local, state, and federal, better engage their communities on climate issues in a justice-centered way? And have you found examples of this engagement in your work?
It's a very good question. I think it really differs sort of depending on what level of government you're thinking, right? If you're thinking about the federal government, we've started to see with the Biden administration a lot more work around engaging communities, organizations, leaders who are focused on climate justice. They established a task force in the White House of a lot of leaders in that work to be advising and commenting on their climate policy proposals. So that's a really exciting step. Whether they actually listen to the advice they receive, is another thing entirely. But I think that taking that big step of inviting those folks in with that kind of expertise is really important. Like this goes back to what I said before about like listening, having that informed policymaking. At for example, a city level, there are lots of ways in which the New York City government, which has an Office of Resiliency and an Office of Sustainability, is really thinking about like going out into communities for these town hall meetings, trying to understand better, for example, what happened during Hurricane Sandy and how can we make sure those communities are safer in the future, and really having those discussions. As someone who is actually an introvert and doesn't really love talking to strangers, which is weird given the work that I've chosen for myself. I think it is very hard for me that the answer is often more conversations, right? Like between government officials and community members and community leaders and scientific experts, that making sure that information is flowing between all of those areas of expertise is really the only way. I don't have a great specific case study example of that, which is a problem. I will work on that.
I have a couple questions here that similar theme. Work in conservation requires a high degree of optimism in the idea that our work can make a difference. Given the serious impacts of climate change on ecosystems and human well-being that we're seeing already, what gives you hope, and how do you overcome feelings of defeat in your work?
I'm not optimistic, which surprises people. I am joyful, but not hopeful. And I think that often, if you don't know the person, you can't necessarily tell the difference. Like, I love my work. I have no expectation that it's actually going to make a difference. I have no idea, right? And I think part of what often holds people back is wanting to know that it's going to make a difference before they start. And so I guess what I would say is do it anyway. In the same way that we know that there's a right and wrong on how we treat each other in many ways, it's the right thing to do to participate in climate solutions in whatever way that means for you. And so maybe just take the leap and see what happens, because obviously some organizations and professionals have a whole big strategy, and they have some indication that things are gonna, that their work will have an impact, but it's really hard to tell what the ripples will be, what the outcomes will be. And I think that's fine, because we gotta try, right? The alternative of just sitting on my couch depressed and reading all the data about species going extinct and ice melting and everything being on fire, that sounds worse to me than trying something that might fail. Is just not trying at all. And so I consider myself a realist, not an optimist. I don't consider myself a hopeful person. I'm not driven by that, but I realize that is in part sort of just how my brain chemistry works. I am not prone to depression, and I was sort of raised that the world is kind of a mess and we each do our little part to try to make it better. My parents were civil rights activists together, and they didn't know if it was going to work, right? If their efforts for racial justice were going to make a difference, but they're well, let me give it a shot anyway, because clearly I care about this thing. And so I focus on being useful instead of being hopeful. And I find that to be very rewarding, because at the end of every day, I can say I tried. And that's gratifying in its own way, and sort of cheesy, but enjoying the process and the journey is a big part of it. And for me, that means crafting milestones for my work that I get to be proud of. Next week, I have an op-ed essay coming out in a newspaper that describes what the Biden administration has done in their first 100 days on ocean and climate policy, and what we think needs to happen next. This is co-authored with two of my favorite ocean policy experts. And that is important to me because that actually can help shift the discourse publicly, but it also is something that actually gets completed, because climate work is forever, right? Healing all the ways in which nature has been damaged, it's important to have these milestones where you're like, well, that piece is done. I published this thing, or we had this event. And I think otherwise it does just become an endless slog. And so having these punctuated moments of, however personal, a sense of a completion has been really helpful to me as I keep going. And don't work with jerks. They will definitely make you depressed and not want to keep going. Just cut out the meanies.
It sounds like you surround yourself with people that bring you joy, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
And you've highlighted the importance of collaboration. Yet one might say that while it's valuable, collaboration is also slow. And we don't have time for slow processes. Climate change is urgent. How would you address that?
Well, if this questioner would like to solve climate change by themselves, by all means, please do. And then I will take a nap. But I think that is also not possible, right? No one can do it alone. And so, and when we try to, we develop incomplete solutions. And a lot of these things require other people to implement them. So we have to bring folks along with us. And I was being a bit glib in my initial answer but I really do appreciate this concern, because I'm someone who's like, let's just get it done already. Enough with the chatting. That is very much my approach to things, is like, I'll just do it myself. But the saying that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, I think absolutely applies to this. And of course, we can aim for both, right? I think the sense of urgency is certainly something that really drives me. And for people who just do not have the patience for the movement building collaboration work, you don't have to do it. Like, I'm not part of environmental groups that are large and operate by consensus or have large bureaucracies, because I share your concern and I don't have the patience for it. And that's fine. I have my own smaller collaborations, right? With 1 or 2 people even, or 10 people, where you harness the collective brain power of a group of people, but you all decide together how fast you can go and sort of push each other to go faster. And your complementary skills actually enable you to go faster. Could I make a climate podcast by myself? Absolutely not. And so I think it sort of depends what you mean by collaboration. We also do need someone at some point to make decisions. So doing everything by consensus is not always the best approach. And I think that's hard for people who are, some people think that that is the way. But when we're talking about writing laws, a lot of laws just remain written on the books and no one enforces them if they don't like them. Something that I learned working with fishing communities in the Caribbean. You can push for policy change, but the fisheries officers are not going to enforce it if the fishermen don't like it, and the fishermen are their cousins, So I think we can have this false sense of efficiency if we change a law or a policy or invent a thing, but who's going to enforce the law? Who's going to manufacture the thing? Who's going to want to deploy the thing? Who's going to write the policies to subsidize the ramping up of the industry of the thing that you've invented. So I think it's a matter of figuring out where you fit within that ecosystem. And if frustrating consensus building meetings is not your jam, just don't do that part. Because I've opted out of a lot of that stuff in favor of smaller collaborative efforts that I've created for myself. So I would say just think more broadly about what collaboration really means for the work that you specifically want to do. And that might help. Because, for example, Congress, right? We can't pass climate legislation unless we have collaboration there. And so in many contexts, that's just intractable. Even sort of within the Democratic Party, there needs to be collaboration to, now that they have the majority of votes in the Senate. And even that's not clear that internal collaboration will work out. So yeah, lots of thoughts and feelings about that one.
You've brought up and addressed the importance of fossil fuel divestment. This question is, what other policies should Carleton College consider enacting beyond taking care of its own carbon footprint?
I think there's an opportunity to think more expansively about carbon footprint beyond electricity. So even within that topic, there's a lot of things to do. For example, I'm not sure what your policies are on sourcing food for your cafeterias and things like that, because agriculture has a huge carbon footprint. And people often think about that simply as beef and the impacts, environmental impacts of industrial animal agriculture. I should specify there are different ways to raise animals that actually have a much smaller carbon footprint, but that's not where we get most of our meat from. But thinking about food more generally, like is the food grown in a way that is using regenerative agriculture practices, which is aiming for restoring nature as the same time as you're producing food? Is it done in a way that the soil absorbs more carbon than it emits, that it maintains habitat for biodiversity, that it doesn't use a lot of pesticides and poisons, that it helps to maintain the quality of the nearby waterways, for example, right? Like, I think agriculture is a huge thing that we all can be thinking about more and need to be thinking about more expansively than just like, are you a vegan or not? It's a lot more about like, what types of farming are we supporting with our dollars, and how we can support local agriculture efforts and people who are really trying to do it right and lead the way. I think that's another exciting thing to think about. And the same goes with like groundskeeping efforts and things like that. And a lot of people are very compelled by the need to reduce the amount of plastic that's produced. And that often gets put into like a pollution category or like recycling kinds of stuff. But plastic is made from fossil fuels. And as fossil fuel companies are realizing that people need less and less of that to fuel their cars and other machines and heat and cool our homes, they are ramping up the construction of plastic factories and facilities. The petrochemical industry is shifting from fossil fuels as fuels to fossil fuels as single-use plastic packaging as a way to keep their demand for their fossil fuel products going. And so the opportunity of reducing single-use plastic especially is actually a way to reduce demand for fossil fuels, as well as all the other reasons why creating this insane amount of waste, very little of it is actually recycled, like 9%. I think there's an opportunity there as well.
We have an artist here who would love to hear details about your collaboration with artists that you mentioned.
So this is very new, but I have 2 projects I can't really tell you that much about yet, because I signed a form that said I couldn't tell you that much about it yet. But one of them is from this, the book, All We Can Save, has been an inspiration for potentially making some sort of film. And so art's in that sense of like, how do we tell different stories visually? Because if we think about the types of documentaries that we see on climate, they're either like really depressing or sort of superficial. And there's not a lot talking about sort of the diversity of solutions we have at our fingertips and what it looks like to actually go and make those things happen. And so I'm really interested in that. We'll see. Stay tuned. It won't be secret forever. And I'm writing a book about climate solutions, tentatively titled "What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futurism." And I've received a fellowship from the Headlands Institute out in California that will fund collaboration with artists. So I'm right now selecting my collaborators for that, people who can help turn my writing and ideas into compelling visual representations. And so my dream is to actually launch that book with an art gallery show with a bunch of different artists kind of interpreting some of the themes that I write about. I think that would be a fun thing to try. Who knows? And I think it's important to think about that, not just like me giving artists direction for what I want them to do, but like me saying, this is what I'm thinking about. How would you express that? Do you see that in the same way, and having it be very iterative? So I'm at the early stages of that work, but working with Fabiana Rodriguez, who has an essay in All We Can Save. She is this incredible artist, and she writes about the need to harness cultural change using the arts. Working with her on her essay really inspired me to think about how I could incorporate some of that into my work. So no details yet, but more on the way.
It's a great teaser. What advice would you give to young women trying to emerge in the fields of marine biology and conservation science?
It's so different now than it was even when I was in school. I think when I was in graduate school, the professors in oceans, it was a lot of like older white male professors and like a very diverse group of young researchers, or like a relatively much more diverse set of younger researchers, diverse in gender, not so much in race. And that is starting to shift now as well. So I think you'll just have a completely different context than I did. I think universities have actually had to do a lot of work to be more inclusive, to make sure professors are not just like wandering around being racist and sexist because they can get away with it. I think there's a lot less of that now. So hopefully you'll have a more, they're just like, you won't have to sort of battle much of that. I didn't really, but I was very sort of independent in my research and had a lovely advisor. So a lot of it depends on who your advisor is. If it's someone who supports you and your work, then that makes all the difference in the world, because they can be a powerful advocate for you. So I guess I would say just like go for it, right? Like, I don't know how it's going to turn out. I certainly didn't know what the next steps would be for me when I was doing my studies in marine biology. And I think that's okay. I think we often assume we have to have like a 5-year plan and achieve everything in the 5-year plan, or else we're a failure. I've never had a 5-year plan. And I don't know what's next, but I've always sort of like worked really hard. And then when the doors open, you're ready. It's that combination of like hard work and luck that I think is sort of unpredictable. You can control the hard work part, and by actually being very collaborative, that helps to create the luck. If you're like known as a productive collaborator, as someone who's pleasant to work with, then all of a sudden, all of these people start inviting you into all of these other things. And that can be really exciting. And I think there's much more of an appetite for applied research now. When I was, 15 years ago, starting my PhD, it was still like very sort of strict boundaries between academic disciplines in a lot of senses. And as someone who wanted to like do it all and connect the dots, that was, I think, much harder than it would be now. So if you're interested in more interdisciplinary work, I think a lot of universities are embracing that approach now, because they understand that all of the ecosystems we're studying are impacted by people, impacted by policy, impacted by economics and culture. And so there's, I think, a much healthier respect for for science being a part of that puzzle. So hopefully you'll go for it and it will be lovely. Good luck.
What would you say is the most influential book, other piece of literature, or author that you've read?
Ooh, kind of want to like turn around and look at my bookshelf. There's honestly a lot of textbooks there that I probably should have read more thoroughly. Do your homework. This is sort of a weird answer. I don't think I've read enough books. I've gotten pretty good at buying books, especially this year during the pandemic. I haven't been that great at reading them. I think some of the stuff that I've been reading lately around like Black feminist thought has been really informative, and how we, and like what community means. There's a book by Adrienne Marie Brown called Emergent Strategy, which has informed my thinking quite deeply, about like how one thing leads to another, how we sort of like create opportunities for change that value people and communities. And there's a book by Mia Birdsong called How We Show Up, which is really about different permutations of what family means in this more modern era. Bell Hooks, All About Love, all these books by Black women who are really thinking about like what it means to be a part of a collective, what really motivates us, what different permutations of society are useful, frameworks to be thinking about. And the reason I've been reading all these books is because this was not part of my formal academic education. And now, as a Black woman doing this work, I felt like I have to catch up. Like, what has everyone else been thinking before my eyes were open to the need to work at this intersection? And so I think I just have a really healthy respect for the thought leadership of the many intellectuals who came before me. And so, I didn't really take any classes on, critical gender or race theory in college. And so I've been doing some of that kinds of reading lately, which is not an answer to like the lifelong question, but that's certainly what's influencing me now. As well but the early book that I think really shaped me was a biography of Rachel Carson, who studied marine science, was just madly in love with nature, realized that spraying all these pesticides, DDT and other toxins as part of agriculture, et cetera, were really harming biodiversity. And she wrote the book Silent Spring. She did a lot of lobbying to get those very toxic chemicals banned. That led to, was one of the things that led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates those sorts of chemicals. And her as just an individual who really cared, who did her research, who wrote about it, who really just changed the shape of environmental work in the US was certainly one of my early inspirations, like seeing someone who just decided like, oh, this is a really big problem. I'm going to do my part to try to figure this out. Was that I was like 12 when I read about her, and she completely knocked my socks off.
Someone has asked, what is it on the framed art behind you, on the wall behind you? What does that say?
It says, it's by my friend Reggie Black, one of my favorite artists. It says, "Mistakes are beautiful." As I walk out of my office, it's important to remind myself of that sometimes, that there's something to be learned even when it doesn't go according to plan.
Well, on that note, we certainly have many more questions, but and I hope that just means that the conversations and discussions will continue here on campus, and I know it will. But could you leave us with a closing comment?
I would just encourage us all to think about climate change as something that is not merely technical, and that we can each contribute to the solutions for, and that we really have most of the solutions already at our fingertips. We don't need a bunch of fancy new technology. We just need to like get to work. And so figuring out what each of us have a different role to play, and figuring that out will be so gratifying and relieving if you don't already know what your role is, and knowing that this is something that can evolve very much. As you know, my work has certainly evolved and shifted over the years in ways that I didn't expect. So just to keep your eyes out for opportunities to be part of solutions, and create opportunities, and try to be like very specific about what you can do, because there are probably things you can do that other people can't. And it's really important that we tap into that and not just all do the same thing with some simple checklist, you know, that this really does require us all to bring our superpowers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. And thank you all for joining us today. This concludes our weekly convocation series for this academic year. We look forward to resuming our convocations in person, on campus next fall. But in the meantime, be well and be kind. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.